Welcome everyone to the Ontology Summit 2025. Today is the 12th of March, 2025. And we are thrilled to have as our speaker today, Dick Fine, who is a British philosopher, currently university professor and Silver Professor of Philosophy and Mathematics at New York University, and a distinguished research professor in the Department of Philosophy, University of Birmingham. It is a corresponding fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the author of multiple books and over 100 articles. He has made notable contributions in the fields of philosophical logic, metaphysics, computer science, economic theory, philosophy of language, as well as ancient philosophy, in particular on Aristotle's account of logic and modality. So I welcome you here and really looking forward to your insights into truthmakers. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have to confess, I'm not altogether clear what it is about Truthmaker Semantics that might be most relevant to the study of applied ontology. So what I thought I would do is just give you a very general introduction and then try to work out from you what it is that you would like me to develop. Truthmaker Semantics is, so-called Truthmaker Semantics is a relatively recent phenomenon. And many people now take it seriously as an alternative to the dominant form of semantics, which is the possible worlds semantics. So let me just briefly try to indicate the major difference between Truthmaker Semantics and the possible world semantics. Both adopt what we might call the truth conditional account of meaning. So under this truth conditional account, the meaning of a sentence is given by the conditions under which it is true. Now, there are various ways of understanding this slogan, but one sort of perhaps very naive but straightforward way is to think that there are things, entities, which are the truth conditions, and they stand in a relation of making true the sentences in question. Okay. So the possible world semantics has a certain spin on this. So the truth conditions, the things, the entities that make true are possible worlds. And possible worlds are meant to be, it's important that they're regarded as complete. They settle every single question, at least within the domain of discourse under consideration. And then to make true is simply for that sentence to be true in that possible world. Given a complete account of how things are, we can then say of any given sentence whether it's true or not. Okay. Now, one thing that you lose in an account of this sort is any sense of relevance, a relevant connection between the truth maker and what it makes true. So if I am now talking under the possible worlds account of possible world semantics, a possible world, if it makes it true, that sentence that I am talking, it makes a lot else true. In fact, it gives you a complete account of how things are. So there's a great deal in the possible world that's not relevant to what it is that makes true. And what Truthmaker Semantics attempts to do is to restore that connection, restore the idea that we should have a relevant connection. And there are different ways to do this, but under Truthmaker Semantics, what we do is insist that the truth maker should be exactly relevant to what it makes true. So it's not just that it be partly relevant, it should be wholly relevant to the sentence. So the fact that I'm sitting will be exactly relevant, but that fact that I'm sitting, the fact that I'm talking, will be exactly relevant to the sentence I'm talking. But the fact that I'm sitting and talking will not be exactly relevant, because it won't be relevant, because the fact that I'm sitting is not relevant to whether I'm talking. So that is the leading idea behind Truthmaker Semantics, that the Truthmaker should be exactly relevant or wholly relevant to what it makes true. And I think that what for me is quite surprising, and it's perhaps quite remarkable, is that this is a very powerful idea. Just building in this notion of relevance really pays huge dividends, at least in my opinion. And so many people, I think, have been exploring this idea of Truthmaker Semantics in the hope that this refinement in the account of the truth conditions will actually, as I say, pay dividend in a number of different applications. So actually, is it worth let me make a couple of remarks in that connection, just so you can have a more concrete idea of what it is that I'm talking about. In the late 60s, early 70s, there's something called situation semantics, which was pioneered by Perry and Bauerweiss. And they had a similar idea. They wanted to overthrow possible world semantics. And they had this idea of situation semantics, where situations that were truth makers. But their situation semantics was one in which the situation was only partially relevant. It wasn't exactly relevant. Though there was a computer scientist, Leonhard Schubert, who also had the idea that one might have an exact semantics. He worked within that tradition. As I say, we need to contrast the idea that the truth maker should be relevant to it being exactly relevant, and where you're working with a very particular conception of relevance here. So let me just give a very simple example of how this notion of exact relevance may be significant in application. So there's Johnny, and you tell Johnny that he may have some ice cream. And he reasons to you as follows. He's done a bit of philosophy here. So he says, look, the statement that I have ice cream is logically equivalent to the statement that I have ice cream or I have ice cream and chocolate. So P is equivalent to P or P and Q. So in permitting me to have ice cream, you've permitted me to either have ice cream or ice cream and chocolate. It's as if you had said you're allowed to have ice cream or ice cream and chocolate. So I'm going to go for the second disjunct. And it's permitting me to have ice cream and chocolate. You have in effect permitted me to have ice cream and chocolate. So I'm going to have some chocolate as well as the ice cream. Something has gone wrong here. Okay. From a classical point of view, P and P or P and Q are logically equivalent. They're true in the very same possible worlds. But from the point of view of truthmaker semantics, they're not equivalent, because the truth makers for P aren't in general the same as truth makers for P or P and Q. So having chocolate and ice cream is not a truth maker for having ice cream. So the proper response to Johnny is, look, you're working within the wrong semantical tradition. You should be working the truth maker condition, and then you'll see that these two statements, that you have ice cream or they have ice cream or chocolate and ice cream, are not actually equivalent, because they don't have the same truth makers exactly. So that is, they're not made true in exactly the same way. That is by means of the very same exactly relevant truth makers. So that's the way you'd have to use truthmaker semantics to refute Johnny here. Okay. All right. So that's just a very simple example of how we might use this more refined semantics to get a better grip on what's involved in statements of this sort. Okay. So this is all by way of informal introduction. And so what I'm going to do is just give you a basic introduction to the more technical aspects of Truthmaker Semantics. So I'm going to have to share the screen to do this. So let me. Okay. So can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, good. Let me see if I can go down here. Oh, I can go down. Good. Okay. So so what I'm going to do now is look a little bit of the formal framework. So I'm supposing we're dealing with a propositional language. So we have sentence letters, and we have the usual truth functional connectives, or, and not. Okay. Now, the semantics can be extended to the case of quantifiers, but let's just put that on one side. And also, I should point out that there are various ways, different ways in which the truthmaker semantics can be developed. And a big division has to do with whether one adopts what's called a unilateral or a bilateral semantics. Under a unilateral semantics, the only semantic primitive you're dealing with is that of making true. But under a bilateral semantics, you operate with two notions, the notions of making true and making false. Okay. So here I'm actually looking, I'm pretty sure I'm dealing here with the bilateral semantics, where we have, we're dealing both in the idea of making true and making false. When you do a possible world semantics, even before you do the semantics, there is this what you might call pre-semantic framework. This is the framework that you're bringing to bear on the semantics. And in the very simplest cases, will be given by a set of possible worlds. In more complicated cases, you have a set of possible worlds with an accessibility relation or some other, maybe a bunch of accessibility relations. So the pre-semantic structure that we have in this case is at least what I call, maybe it's commonly called a state space. Okay. And a state space consists of a set of states, which I've called S here. And we also need a part-whole relation on these states. So there's a mereological structure involved here. We talk about one state being part of another. And this is the notion, this is what you would expect it to be. So my sitting and talking will have as a part my sitting and have as a part my talking. Now, I call these things states, but states is a term of art. So there is an intuitive notion of state. There is a state of my being hungry or what have you. But these states don't have to be states in any intuitive sense of the term. They're just whatever you want to take to be the truth makers. Okay, so they could be laws, for example, even though a law isn't in an intuitive sense a state. It could be a law, or it could be an event of my falling isn't in an intuitive sense a state, but it may well be something that makes true the sentence that I fall. Okay, so don't be put off by the use of the term state here. It's just, as I say, it's a term of art here that's just used to cover whatever it is that the truth makers might be. And we're supposing that these, as I say, that these states are ordered by a relationship of part-whole. Now, in what's called a modalized state space, we distinguish certain of these states as possible states. So this is a subset of the given states. Okay. Now, there are certain applications that don't require us to distinguish between a subset of possible states, but I guess in the what I'm doing here involves a modalized state space. So if you have this distinguished subset, then of course that allows for the possibility of there being impossible states. And in many of the applications of truthmaker semantics, you do take seriously the idea that there are impossible states. So if there's a state of my standing and the state of my sitting, we all suppose that there might be a state of my standing and sitting, even though this is an impossible state. Okay. So now we have various conditions. This is the structure. It's a consists of three components: a state S of states, another set of possible states, and a part-whole relation defined on the states. So I've actually given some standard conditions that are imposed here. The first is that S is just a set. Second is that S diamond, this is the set of possible states, is a subset of S. which is closed under part. That is, we take any part of a possible state to be a possible state. And that's the only condition imposed upon S diamond. And we have this part-whole relation. And this is subject to two conditions. One is to be a partial order, that is reflexive, transitive, and anti-symmetric. And the other is that it be complete. That is, that any subset of states. Here I've actually had any subset with an upper bound has a least upper bound. This is actually what's called bounded completeness. Often we impose a stronger condition, which is that any subset T of S has a least upper bound. I don't know if you recall the definition of a least upper bound. It's used in lattice theory. So an upper bound of a set is a set which is something that lies above the given set. So everything in the given set is a part of that set, where the relation is part of. A least upper bound is one that is the least state with that property. So it's a part of any property with that state. So that's a least upper bound. And then completeness will say that any subset of the set of states has a least upper bound, which intuitively is just a fusion. So if I have the state of my sitting and the state of my talking, then intuitively the least upper bound of that state is simply the state of my sitting and talking. Okay. So actually, this is quite a rich structure. It's basically just a complete lattice with a distinguished subset, the set of possible states. I should mention that maybe that when I first started thinking about Truthmaker semantics, I was so much in the grip of the possible world semantics that I just presupposed that every state would be a possible state. But actually, this turns out not to be such a great assumption. Took me a long time to appreciate the value, to embrace the impossible. Yes. Anyway, so that's the underlying pre-semantic framework. We've done no semantics so far. Okay. So I don't know if there are any questions on that. Okay. So let's move on. And now we're going to be doing the semantics. And what we do is we want to connect this state space with the language. And remember, we have a very simple language. And we just have the propositional letters or sentence letters. And formulas are constructed from them by means the usual truth functional connective. So we now, what we do is we extend the state space so that it now can be aligned with the language. So we get what I call the state space model. And this is a classical state space model. So this is the kind of model that's appropriate when we're giving a classical semantics. Now, there are other kinds of semantics you might give within the Truthmaker framework, but I'm dealing with a classical semantics. Okay. So what we add to a state space is evaluation. This is a function that takes each sentence letter of our language into a pair of sets. Intuitively, the first set is the set of truth makers, and the second set is a set of falsity makers. Okay. So we say for each sentence letter, which states make it true are the exact truth makers for the sentence, and which are the exact falsity makers. Okay. And within the classical context, there are two conditions that one might wish to impose. Well, we should impose, actually, on these evaluations. The first I call exclusivity, which says that any truth maker is incompatible with a falsity maker. Now, I haven't actually defined the notion of incompatibility, but we can do that in terms of this S diamond, because, okay, the fusion of two states is the least upper bound, and we know that also always exists. And two states are compatible when the fusion is a possible state, and incompatible when the fusion isn't a possible state. So given S diamond, we can define what it is for two states to be compatible or incompatible. And then what exclusivity says is that any truth maker for a sentence letter should be incompatible with a truth maker, with a falsity maker. Okay. Okay. And that's a very natural condition. And another condition is what I call the exhaustivity. And this says that any possible state is compatible either with the truth maker or with the falsity makers. So given some possible way of how things are, there should either be a possible way in which the statement can be made true, compatible with that given possible state, or a possible state in which it's made false. So this says that any possible state, I can see, any possible state S is compatible with the truth maker for P or with the falsity maker for P. So these are two conditions that within the classical context, one should impose actually on the truth makers and the falsity makers. As I say, if you're not in the classical context, you might want to drop S diamond, and just so you wouldn't even be in a position to state these conditions. Okay, so that's actually a somewhat simpler framework, but here I'm just dealing with the classical framework. Now, what we do is we want to extend these clauses for truth making and falsity makers. We want to say, so we've just stipulated what the truth makers and falsity makers for a sentence letter are, subject to certain conditions. And now what we want to do is to say what the truth makers and falsity makers for more complex sentences might be. So we have the clauses for sentence letters. And so what I've used here is this double turnstile for, I've used a double turnstile for truth with a turnstile to the right for truth making, and a double turnstile with the bar to the right, turnstile to the right for falsity making. And so we've just stipulated by phi what the truth makers and falsity makers for a sentence letter are. Now, under the bilateral semantics, we can say that the truth makers for not B are simply the falsity makers for B, and the falsity makers for not B are the truth makers for B. Okay, so that's straightforward. The clause now for conjunction is the most distinctive clause in the semantics. So what we want to ask is, when do we have a truth maker for a conjunction B and C? Well, we want a standard clause for this is a truth maker for B and C is a truth maker for B and a truth maker for C. But this won't do because a truth maker for B and C will usually contain a great deal that's irrelevant to the truth maker for B, or irrelevant to the truth maker for C. So what we say is a truth maker for B and C is the fusion of a truth maker for B and a truth maker for C. So if B is the sentence I am sitting and C is the sentence I am talking, then the truth maker for that conjunction that I'm sitting and I'm talking will be the fusion of a truth maker for I am sitting and a truth maker for I am talking. Then we have that, so that's, as I say, that what we do is taking heed of the fact that we want exact truth makers here. And this is why we need the mereological notion of fusion here, because the way we obtain a truth maker for conjunction is by fusing truth makers for the respective conjuncts. A falsity maker for a conjunction is a falsity maker for one of the conjuncts. We have dual clauses for disjunction. So a falsity maker, a truth maker for B or C is simply a truth maker for B or for a truth maker for C. And a falsity maker for B or C is a fusion of falsity makers for B and for C. Okay. And now, once we have this notion of truth making and falsity making for complex formulas, we can define various other notions. So we can define a notion of particular interest is notion of inexact truth maker. Inexact truth maker for a sentence is something that has as a part an exact truth maker. So even though my sitting and my talking is not an exact truth maker for the sentence I am sitting, it's an inexact truth maker because it contains an exact truth maker. And we can define various logical notions. So for example, we can say two sentences are logically equivalent if in every model they have the same truth makers. So actually, let's go back to the example I considered before when we have P or P and Q, that sentence, complex formula, P or P and Q. Then this will not, in general, at least in every model, have the same truth makers as P, because one of the truth makers for P or P and Q will be a truth maker for P and Q, and the truth maker for P and Q will be the fusion of a truth maker for P and a truth maker for Q. But there's no reason in general to think that that will be a truth maker for P. So this semantics immediately delivers the result that we shouldn't expect P to be equivalent to P or P and Q, which is the basic logical fact I appeal to in motivating one of the applications of the semantics. That is to John's argument that he should be allowed the chocolate as well as the ice cream. Okay, so that is really, in a nutshell, is a basic application of the semantics to classical logic. Okay, so a philosopher called Nolan has talked about the hyperintentional revolution, and there's a question of exactly what that means. So intentionality is the idea that we don't distinguish between sentences that are intentionally the same, and intentionally the same means same in the same, true in the same possible worlds. Okay, so we think of intentionality in terms of the possible world semantics. So if the possible world semantics doesn't distinguish between these sentences, we shouldn't distinguish between them. And so the hyperintentional revolution is we should distinguish. Now, why is this a revolution? We knew from long ago that intentionally equivalent or necessarily equivalent sentences don't behave the same way in belief contexts. If we take maybe any two mathematical truths are true in the same possible worlds, but I can believe one without believing the other. So this is something we knew long ago. So why is this a revolution? It's a revolution because the hyperintentionality is of a completely different nature from what it's normally been supposed to be. So if you take the belief case, okay, so let's actually go back to a simpler case. I believe that Hesperus is Hesperus, but I don't believe that Hesperus is I believe Hesperus is Hesperus, but I don't believe that Hesperus is phosphorus. And the thought has been this, that we may have the same proposition, but it's been presented in two different ways. So in other words, the concepts by which that proposition has been presented are different. In the one, we have the very same object, the morning star, but it can be presented either as Hesperus or as phosphorus, as it can be presented as the morning star or as the evening star. So there are two different ways of presenting this proposition. This is the idea in Frege, that he thought these were oblique contexts, and what's going on is that we have a different presentation of the same thing, and that's what is accounting for the failure of substitutivity in these cases. The way I like to think of it is this: the hyperintentionality that's involved here is of a very different nature. It has to do not with different presentation of the same thing, but different ways in which something can be realized. So if we take P versus P or P and Q, the way this can be made true, these two statements can be made true, is different. So this is, as it were, a difference from below rather than difference from above. This is a difference in what makes the statement true. That is, it's a difference in the world itself rather than the difference in how we actually are representing the world. So it's a difference not in representation, but in realization. Okay. And the significance of this is that you might think that the difference in representation is only relevant to what are called propositional attitudes. And when we have beliefs or what have you, or know things, how we present the underlying information can matter. But here we're not talking about a difference of this sort. We're talking about a difference in actually how the world itself relates to the sentence in question. And what that means is that this phenomenon is not simply relevant to attitudinal phenomena, to mental phenomena. It may also be relevant, for example, to counterfactuals. Counterfactuals relate to the world. They don't, you would think, most naturally think that the truth of a counterfactual doesn't depend upon how we're representing the facts. But what it is that realizes, makes true a sentence, will presumably be relevant to a counterfactual. And so, so the actual application then of hyperintentionality becomes much, much broader. And in particular, it's relevant to statements that concern not with our attitudes, but with actually how the world is. So to my mind, this is the true significance of the hyperintentional revolution. It's an appreciation of how hyperintentionality may arise in a completely different way from how it's commonly been supposed to arise. Okay, that's a more philosophical remark about the significance. Now, it may be that at this point I need some feedback because there are just so many different. I'm giving you one basic application here, which is the classical logic, and there's so many other applications that I could consider, and not just applications, but theoretical developments. And so maybe at this point, I just don't want to just talk in a way that's not relevant to the interests of the people here. So maybe I can get some feedback. I'll stop sharing. What's there something? Maybe there's stuff in chat. I don't know if I should be looking in chat. Let me look in chat to see.
There are a
Muted.
few comments in chat, but
Since we are muted, you have to look at chat.
Well, let me look at chat and see if there's anything here. Oh, so one question I've dealt with, what is the relation between truth makers and the hyperintentional revolution? Let me just make a comment here. What I'm talking about is truth maker semantics. Okay, not truth makers. Okay.
Yes.
Many people have wanted to talk about truth makers in many different contexts. So, for example, people have thought that we need to do metaphysics. There's this movement led by Armstrong that we need to use truth makers, talk about truth makers and doing metaphysics. Armstrong, it wasn't particularly interested in the truth maker semantics. Okay. So many people have had a purely metaphysical interest in truth makers. Okay. So I'm interested in truth maker semantics. That is doing semantics via truth makers. And it's when I say truth maker semantics, what I mean is exact truth maker semantics. Okay, there are many truth maker semantics. So for me, truth maker semantics is short for exact truth maker semantics. Just to get that clear, the terminology clear. Is fusion like a new state with weights of each? No. Fusion is just plain. In mereology, we have a theory of part whole. Okay. And the notion of fusion can be defined in various ways. My own preferred definition is that it's not the usual definition given. People, I think, have slavishly followed the Poles who really discovered or initiated the development of mereology. And fusion actually for some strange reason, the Poles tends to take overlap as primitive, to think in terms of overlap. Anyway, my own preferred view is to think of the different ways of defining fusion. My own preferred definition, at least in this context, is in terms of the least upper bound. So a fusion is simply a least upper bound. So it's above the entities, the states in question, and it's the least thing above. So all the things below are part of the thing above, and that thing above is a part of anything else that's above. So it's just as purely formal definition, familiar from lattice theory as a least upper bound. Sorry, I'm just you said that the truth, so I'm looking at some of these questions as they come up. You said that the truth maker of P and Q is the fusion of the truth maker for P, not the truth maker. Okay, so a sentence will in general have many truth makers. So if I've got a disjunction P or Q, even if this is not true for the atomics, it may be true for the atomic sentences, but even if it's not true for the atomic sentences, it will be true for the non-atomic sentences, because the true P or Q has anything that's a truth maker for P or a truth maker for Q will be a truth maker for P or Q. So in general, a sentence will have many truth makers. And so if you've got a conjunction P and Q, it will have as a truth maker anything that's a fusion of a truth maker for P or a truth maker for Q. A very interesting issue here has to do with whether P and P, the sentence P and P, is equivalent to P. Okay, so now P has two truth makers. Let's call them S and T. Now, so S is a truth maker for P and T is a truth maker for P. Now look at P and P. A truth maker for P and P will be a fusion of any truth maker for P and any truth maker for P. So one truth maker for P is S, another is T. So the fusion of S and T will be a truth maker for P and P. So P and P will contain the fusion, will have as a truth maker anything that's a fusion of a truth maker for P, of two truth makers for P. Okay. Now, will P itself have as a truth maker anything that's a truth maker for any truth fusion of truth makers for P? Well, it's not. I haven't said that it was. So under one kind of semantics, we insist that the truth makers, even for atomic sentences, be closed under fusion, and then we can guarantee that P and should have the same truth makers as P and P. But otherwise, P and P may not have the same truth makers as P. This is a very significant issue in the logic of counterfactuals. Okay, and for a time I resisted the idea that P might not be logically equivalent to P and P, but now I've come around to actually thinking that there are contexts in which we don't want P and P to be equivalent to P, just for this reason. Okay, so I'm just digressing a bit here, but explaining the importance of why of a sentence having several truth makers. You said that the truth maker for P and Q is the fusion of the truth maker for P and the truth maker, a truth maker. But why is that fusion more relevant than the usual truth maker for P and Q in classical logic? Okay, so the standard clause in classical logic is that a truth maker for P and Q is something that's a truth maker for P and a truth maker for Q. So if we're in, so if I take, I think I discussed this, but let me repeat. Take the sentence I'm sitting and I'm talking. That sentence, it's a conjunction. Okay, a truth maker for this will be I'm sitting and talking. Okay, this is not an exact truth maker for I am sitting, because it talks about me, because it involves my talking, which is not relevant to my sitting. So the classical clause loses this notion of exact relevance. It no longer, the truth maker, if you adopt that clause, the truth maker may no longer be exactly relevant to a sentence. Okay, so that's why we have the clause that we do. Okay, and that's why we actually need a mereology, because to preserve exact relevance, we need to fuse these truth makers for the conjuncts. As a simple engineer, I look at the use of the notion of there being truth makers as a way to firmly characterize what is an ontology of concept in the domain of discourse, as distinct from ontologies of data, pretending to be the things. That is what it means to be this thing. Interesting how these things relate to that. I'm not sure I
Mike, you
fully
can
understand.
unmute yourself.
Sure, yeah. So thanks, Ken. Thanks, Ken. It's great insights and stuff, but I'm trying as a humble engineer to kind of connect all this logic and stuff to a simple problem that we have in the ontology world, that you have people say, oh, I want an ontology. Great, I'll hire an ontologist. They'll do something in OWL and they'll have, say, a class called bank, and it will have a property that is FDIC insurance or a property that is banking license. And they think they're defining what it means to be a bank, and they're not, because the meaning in real world is what are the legal capacities it has, what are the accounting realities and so on. And so I always see truth makers as a way of saying that we're not describing some data here with data that's evidence of some legal capacity. We're describing the actual meaning of the thing, which is defined in terms of an actual legal capacity, which is a thing in the world. And so how do you see like how we apply the notion of truth makers to how we say what it means to be a thing, what it means to be a bank, what it means to be a legal person and so on, in terms of properties that are framed in real world terms rather than data terms?
Okay. So this is a sort of very general remark you're making. I remember long ago, I was actually you probably heard of Judea Pearl. He was at in the computer science department at UCLA when I was there, and actually we talked about his causal modeling. And I remember examining one. I was on the committee examining one of his students who was giving some kind of semantics, and I tried to point out that this semantics didn't actually relate to the real world. It was, as it were, what you might call an internal semantics that just concerned the relationships between various expressions or concepts, if you like. And that the truth, there's something to be said for giving a semantics that relates to the real world. I actually thought that it would actually have been helpful in the context of his thesis. I could not convey that thought to them. They could not get it. Okay.
Right.
The idea that when you're talking about objects in the real world, so the point of view, these people were basically solipsists. They thought, where the mind was simply the database or what have you. It's as if there was nothing outside the database. So yeah. So of course, at the end of the day, all of this stuff should relate to what's going on in the real world. And you can actually think of Truthmaker Semantics as doing that, because the truth makers are things out there in the real world. Of course, there's a more idealistic application where the truth makers aren't. So there is something that's called the canonical model in Truthmaker Semantics. I don't know if you're aware of canonical model in logic. So when we prove completeness, for example, okay, this is a very nice illustration. So you want to prove completeness of first order logic, let's say. Okay. So you've got a consistent set of formulas. You want to show that it has a model. And what you do is you construct the model using the resources of the language. So what does, I have an individual constant in the language A. What does it signify in the canonical model? A, or maybe an equivalence class of all those constants that are taken to be identical to it. It got a predicate. What's it true of? It's true of the constants. So that logic, that model you construct is constructed from the very language itself. Okay, it's an idealistic model. The only thing that exists is the language. Okay, and actually for the purposes of proving completeness, that is fine. You can actually get away with this. And similarly in the Truthmaker Semantics, there is in fact, you can use this for completeness in this context as well. I ask, what's the truth maker for P, the sentence letter P? P itself. It can be, in the canonical model, you can take it to be P itself. Okay. So for certain purposes, you can think in these terms. You can think, look, there's nothing outside of the language. Okay. And you can even do the semantics that way, as it were. So everything's within the language. But it's important to bear in mind, and this is sometimes significant. I mean, it may not be significant for policemen, that you're dealing with the real world. So yeah, the general point you're making is an important one. Now, even if you think that Python done that, even if at this point of view, all we're talking about is something very general here. So I'm glad you welcome the idea that we're talking about the real world here. But Truthmaker Semantics is just one particular way of talking about the real world. Now, what I think is significant is this. Actually, this is very significant. You might think the possible world semantics relates to the real world, but it doesn't relate to the real world in a helpful way. Because how does it relate to the real world? It's relating to the possible world. Well, it's maybe relating to the individuals, it's relating to the possible world. So these huge things, okay? Whereas what we have in possible world semantics is a much more fine-grained way, much more delicate, sensitive way of relating to the real world. Because we're relating now to very particular facts. The fact that this person has a particular address or what have you. Okay. So we can have a much better handle on what it is that the language is saying about the real world. So anyway, yeah. So I don't know if that's helpful, but anyway.
Yes, thank you. It was very.
Okay. So I'm just going to go through some of these. You are saying internal semantics vocabulary, and that is acceptable. But then how do you relate it to the real world? Well, it's I'm not quite sure how to answer this question. It's just, I mean, we're giving us semantics. I mean, of course, if you're dealing, let's say, with some banking system, you have to know something about the banking system and so on and so forth. But it's no job of the semantics to do that. It's rather that if you want to develop a semantics, you may want the semantics to be of a kind that says there are things in the real world which are relating to the language that you use. Okay, maybe you can comment on how TMS can help us understanding modal operators. Possible semantics is quite vexing problem. You have to discuss the example of all. Oh yeah, so yeah, great. I don't know if this is especially relevant to ontologies, but yeah, I wrote a paper on the application the application Truthmaker Semantics to deontic logic. That is the logic of deontic operators. Other people have done that as well. Other people have now discussed the application to the modal lethic modal operators. So actually that paper turned into a 3-part paper, and I still need to write a 4th part. So, but let me say a little bit about the application that I made. So now the way this is done within the possible world tradition is as follows: that we have the idea of there being certain permissible worlds, you know. So so given how things are, certain other worlds are permissible, and of course the actual world presumably is not one of them. Some some optimistic person may think so, but anyway, so these are the worlds you permissibly can be in. Okay, so then you say that it's permissible that P is true if P is true in some permissible world. Then you say that P is obligatory if it's true in every permissible world. So that you have to do P has to be the case if you to remain within a permissible world. So these are just the standard clauses, okay, for a modal operator. It's just now that we understand, instead of talking about a possible world, we talk about a permissible world, okay. The semantics I developed is very different. So it actually starts off with the semantics for imperative logic. So I'm interested in imperatives: shut the door, or shut the door, or open the window, okay. And I was interested in the idea that, I mean, an imperative tells you to do something. So I was thinking the idea of an action that's in exact compliance or an exact contravention to an imperative. So I say, shut the door. That's asking me to perform a certain action, shut the door. Now, if I shut the door and open the window, that's not an exact compliance with the statement, shut the door. Okay. So what I wanted to do was to give a semantics for imperatives that use the notion of exact compliance and exact contravention in place of the notions of exact truth making and exact falsity making. So basically, to give a semantics for these imperatives that tells you when an action is in exact compliance or exact contravention. Okay. Now, what I did was build then a semantics for deontic operators on the basis of the semantics for the imperatives. So I took seriously the idea that when you say you're permitted to open the door, the permission operator applied to an imperative. What's permitted is you open the door. You're permitting, okay, you're saying this certain action is permitted. So what we actually have then in semantics is basically you're told, I'm simplifying here, but basically you're told not what possible worlds are permitted, but which actions are permitted. And then for it to be true that you're permitted to open the door is for one of the actions, actually it's not for one of the actions, it's for every one of the actions. This is interesting. It's for every one of the actions in compliance with the imperative to be permitted. So if I say, so this is this actually relates back to Johnny. Okay. I didn't really go, in the case of John, I didn't go into detail. I just said we need to distinguish between P and P or P and Q. I did not explain how that difference might then explain why the one is permitted and the other isn't. I didn't give that detailed explanation. Now I'm giving that more detailed explanation. So what I'm saying is that you're permitted to X, where X is imperative, really. That's true if every action in exact compliance with X is permitted. Now, if the imperative is X or X and Y, then one of the actions in exact compliance with that is the action of Xing and Ying. So for that statement to be true, that action must also be permitted. So in other words, with the possible world semantics, you simply have an existential clause. You're just saying that there's a permissible world in which the statement is true. Here I'm saying every action in compliance with the embedded imperative should be permitted. Okay. And that's why, although John is permitted to eat ice cream, he's not permitted to eat ice cream or eat ice cream and chocolate, because one of the actions in compliance with that, if I tell Johnny eat ice cream or eat chocolate and ice cream, one of the ways he can do to exactly comply with that is to eat chocolate and ice cream. So when I'm saying it's permitted, I'm saying he's permitted to perform one of those actions. So, okay. So then that semantics for permission now gives me the result I wanted, that he's not actually permitted to do the disjunction. So anyway, so that's how at least I do the deontic logic. Okay. So the first, this is a three-part paper. The first paper dealt with semantics of imperatives. The second, with the semantics for permission. And the third part dealt with conditional imperatives. If I say, if it's raining, then take an umbrella, what have you. And the fourth part of the paper, which I haven't yet written, well, I've partly written, but I haven't submitted for publication, it deals with conditional deontic statements. Like if it's raining, then you're permitted to take an umbrella, what have you, whatever it might be. Okay. So anyway, so the semantics proceeds very differently. The semantics, in a way, this relates to what I said before about how these things relate to the real world. If you look at the standard possible world semantics, at the end of the day, all we're talking about are what the permissible worlds are. What's a permissible? Which worlds are permissible? That's really at the end of the day what you're talking about. here we're talking about what the permissible actions are, or what permissible actions might be in various scenarios. So again, we're relating in a more finely grained way to what's really at issue. Okay. So actually, in the possible world semantics, what you do is you have a privileged set of worlds, the permissible worlds. What I have in the possible world semantics is a privileged set of actions, namely the permitted actions. I'm simplifying here, but anyway, I'm just trying to bring out a stark difference here in how the two semantics proceed. Okay, I hope that's an answer to that question. Should I just go through the other things here? Oh, 3 new messages. Let's see. Maybe I should look at this. How about the lethic operators? Okay. Actually, it's kind of surprising that there's some recent work on the modal operators, but there's perhaps no settled view on how best to do the modal operators. So the basic question is this: what's a truth maker for a possibility statement or for a necessity statement? And one thought is that whenever you have a possibility statement, there's going to be a fact in the world that's exactly relevant to rendering that thing possible. Okay, so we just take as primitives this idea that there's certain things that render something possible. So that's one, and then you have to deal also with in necessity or impossibility, and then you have to have things that they might have the idea that there are certain things that render something impossible. So one idea, I'm not saying it's the only one, is to treat as a semantical primitive the idea that there are things in the world that render other things possible or impossible. Okay. And of course, in dealing with semantics, then you have to actually, you have this primitive semantic notion, and then you have to lay down appropriate conditions, so you actually end up with the right logic. But as I think there's right now, there's not. I don't think things are really settled actually on the lethic modal front. Maybe also not on the deontic modal front. Sorry, Ravi Sharma has a raised
Yeah,
hand.
I'm just a little bit more curious to follow up on what Mike Raven has put in on the chat.
Okay.
If you start with a
Can I look? Let me just read it. Let me just read it.
Go ahead.
You distinguish Truthmaker semantics from Truthmaker metaphysics. TMS allows states to be anything that conforms to the structures imposed on the state space. Do you expect these structures will seamlessly transpose to Truthmakers in metaphysics? If not, does this unduly limit? Yeah, my own view on this is that the use of Truthmakers in metaphysics is a mistake. A big mistake. And I mean, I'm sure Mike's aware of this. What I think we should be talking about is not the notion of truth making, but the notion of ground. So what we want to know is if something's the case, you might think, well, what's the people interested in? Yeah. So Johnny, talk about Johnny. Johnny is a bachelor. What makes this true, you might say, is that he's an unmarried man. So it's his being unmarried and his being a man. Those are the two things that make it true. Now, the way I'd like to express this is that it's in virtue of Johnny being unmarried and Johnny being a man that he's a bachelor. So that's the way I'd like to put it. So I don't talk about facts or anything like that. I have what logicians call a sentential connective. I think there's having this operator, virtue of, which connects two sentences on the left or two sentences on the right. So Johnny is a bachelor. That is in virtue of it being the case that Johnny is unmarried and Johnny is a man. That's how I'd like to put it. Now, when you put it, this is how Armstrong would put it, when you say, well, what are the facts in the world that make it true? It seems to me you're just introducing something irrelevant. That is a reference to facts. And you're not simply introducing something irrelevant. It's a dangerous irrelevance, because there's a view according to which at the end of the day, what makes it the case, what something is the case in virtue of some fact obtaining. That's one view. That at the end of the day, we need facts. Okay. Another point of view is the fact that Johnnyism, the fact that that there is such a fact as Johnny being unmarried, that's the case in virtue of Johnny being unmarried. So with the terminus is just Johnny being unmarried, not some fact that Johnny is unmarried. So a metaphysics in terms of truth makers, where the truth makers are facts, presupposes that the terminus of, as a metaphysics inquiry, the facts. But that, I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying it needn't be the case. Okay. So
context and prior knowledge were
I'm sorry,
implied when you
sorry,
context.
can you say that again?
Context and prior knowledge were implied in how you analyze this sentence, Johnny is a bachelor.
Yes, of course, yes.
So where do you get that data from when you talk of truth makers, semantics?
Yeah,
Where does reality?
That's a general issue, that how we understand these things depends upon context and so on and so forth. So that's
In particular, since truthmaker semantics can be a closed, self-defined definitions, how does it connect with reality in real life? What is the bridge? What is the technique? You use some prior knowledge in this example.
I don't know how to answer that question. I just a semantics is only meant to do a certain thing. I mean, just take truth functional semantics for propositional logic. We have a semantics, we assign truth values to sentence letters. And then on that basis, we work out what the truth values of other sentence letters, more complex formulas are. Now you ask, oh, how do you know when a sentence is true? It's not the job of a truthmaker semantics to settle those questions. All I'm saying about truthmaker semantics is it's a semantics that relates the meanings of the logical connectives to what's going on in the world. That is to the very particular facts. But now what those facts are and so on and so forth, that's not the job of truthmaker semantics. Yeah. And again, there's an interesting question as to context and so on. People in the possible world semantics have actually thought very carefully about context. I mean, there's the early work of David Kaplan, the logical demonstratives and so on, where he actually said, look, we can talk about context in a systematic way. Okay. And that was very important for that reason. Presumably something similar could be done in the case of truthmaker semantics, though it hasn't been done to a great extent. But what I would say is this, that one of the contexts, when the truthmaker semantics, you can have a more refined conception of what the context is. And in fact, that's something that people wanted to do within situation semantics. So it doesn't have to be necessarily the whole world, but something less than the whole world. Okay, so that's...
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I may just ignore something. I'll just pick the questions that seem especially interesting to me, even though they may just doesn't seem to represent actions like passing the salt. My point was that it can't be made to do the job of semantics. Well, as I say, if you take, there's a general question of whether semantics can do the job of pragmatics. You might think they're distinct. So of course, no semantics can do the job of pragmatics. But insofar as look, there's pragmatics and pragmatics. The meaning of I depends upon the context. So roughly speaking, I refers to the speaker. Okay. So it depends. What it refers to depends upon the context. Okay. So that has to do with the meaning of I. So you might think it's part. So you might think it belongs to semantics, just because it has to do with the meaning. Now, also, people might think, oh, well, it involves context. So how can we deal with it in a systematic way? Well, what Kaplan showed is you could deal with these pragmatic aspects of meaning in a systematic way. He developed a pragmatic, a systematic account of these words. And it seems to me that Truthmaker Semantics is as well equipped as any semantical approach for dealing with this aspect of pragmatics. Now, whether if we stray outside of semantics, as I've and it can have some other kind of systematic application, I simply do not know. Possibly it does, but I just do not know the answer to that question.
Roman has his hand up.
Oh, okay.
Could you unmute yourself, Roman?
Hold on. Yeah. Okay. View.
Okay, I'm sorry. Hi.
Hi.
Is the sound good?
Yeah. If you speak up, that will help.
Yeah. The main question, consider the moment of correspondence. So you define some semantics, yeah, and but do not define the way of establishing this relation of correspondence between, how to say, theory and some truth maker. So you say about correspondence, but do not provide us with the constructive way of how can we know that the correspondence is true, is a fact between the subject and the world?
Well, of course, I mean, I was dealing with an uninterpreted language, so I got these sentence letters, and there's a formal semantics where I just assign truth makers. Now, of course, if you're dealing with an interpreted language, I mean, actually, the examples were interpreted like that. So I have the sentence, I am sitting. That's a sentence of English. So because it means what it does, it's going to have a particular kind of truth maker, namely the fact, if you like, that I'm sitting. Now, if you ask, how do I know that that's...
So,
how do I know that that's correct? Well, it just... I mean, there are issues here, which is that you might think, well, look, there are different ways I could be sitting. I could be slouching, I could be sitting upright, and so on. So are these all different truth makers? These are very serious questions, actually, in the application of the semantics. I can't help having the feeling that you're asking the semantics to do something that it's not designed to do. Of course, in applying the semantics, you may need to make use of non-semantical knowledge. So I guess this is partly why I'm puzzled by this.
I'm sorry, but
it's hard for me to see that there are real issues here.
If we define semantics, we presuppose that semantics has to be, it should work. It should somehow work, and there should be given the specific way of working for this semantics. Yes. And so how can it be true? How can it be verified?
So
Verificated.
look, we have to ask, what is the semantics trying to do? Okay, if you say, how does it work? I mean, how does a clock work? Well, the clock's meant to tell the time. You can't answer that question until you ask, what is the clock for? Okay, so we have to first of all consider, what is the semantics for? Now, there can be more or less modest goals here. Okay, a fairly modest goal, and some people actually think there's nothing else to be said. That's not my view. Is that semantics should tell us what the logical, should give an underpinning for the logical relationships that hold. So some things can imply other things in a logical way, some sort of, well, in a appropriately strong sense. Okay, semantics tells us that. Okay, so P implies P or Q, you might think. Okay, how come? Well, I give a semantics for disjunction. A disjunction is true if just one of the disjuncts is true. Imply means truth preservation. So if P is true, P or Q is true. So the semantics now is vindicating that judgment that P or Q follows from P.
So by using implication, we just, avoid the question of truthness, yes? So we do not need to know the truth value, we just say if.
Yeah, look,
Condition.
no semantics is going to tell you which ordinary statements are true. It may tell you which statements of the semantic theory are true, but no semantics is meant to tell you what's true. Logic doesn't tell you what's true. Okay, that's not the aim.
No, what's true.
Semantics is a study of meaning. It tells you what meaning is. It doesn't tell you what's true. Okay, all right. Now, but I think that, let me go back. I said a modest goal, and some people think this is all you can reasonably aim for, is to provide some kind of explanation of what follows from what. Okay. Now, certainly Truthmaker Semantics is doing that because, I go back to Johnny. I said it follows from the fact that John is permitted to do X or Y, that he's permitted to X. And I gave a semantic, classical semantics for permission doesn't predict that. This semantics does. So there's a case when it's achieving this modest goal. Okay.
Okay. May I ask?
Let me finish.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Now, you may have a less modest goal. You may want to think that in the semantics, we're modeling real case scenarios, that the world is a certain way, and the semantics can actually provide a model for how
I know, but what can serve as a truth maker for truth maker?
I'm sorry, what can serve as ask that again.
What can serve, what is to be served as a truth maker? Okay, not truth maker, but reality maker for the truth maker.
I don't know what you mean by it.
How can we know that this specific truth maker A makes some proposition true? How can we know? How can we establish this correspondence between them? Okay. The way of establishing this.
Okay. So I think, okay, take the corresponding question about possible world semantics. How do we know that in the actual, there's one possible, there's the actual world. How do I know that it's true that I'm sitting in the actual world, sitting right now? Well, you know it because you know that I'm sitting. There's nothing more to be said. Okay. Okay. Now, in the case of Truthmaker Semantics, it's a little more complicated. How do I know and now if you ask, what are the possible worlds in which it's true that the sentence I'm sitting is true? But all you can say is that it's the possible worlds in which I'm sitting. There's nothing more to be said. There's nothing more to be known. Okay, this is a non-question. Now, if you ask, I went through this. If you ask of the sentence I am sitting, what are the truth makers for that? it is more complicated. There is now there is now a real question, because you could say, look, the truth maker is simply that I'm sitting, but you might think a truth maker is meant to be an exact. You might actually think, no, that I could be sitting in various ways, and the truth makers for the sentence I am sitting should be the various ways in which I'm sitting. Okay. So I'm sitting upright, sitting. Okay. Well, again, another example is color. Take this is red. Are the truth makers for this just it's being red, or it's being scarlet, or what have you, different shades of red? Okay. This is a very serious question in the application of the semantics. And my own view is that the state. This is my own view, and I don't know if this is answering your question, because it's very hard for me to get a real feel for that there is a question here. But my own view on this is the following. Every piece of discourse presupposes a certain state space, that when we're talking about the color of the wall or what have you, we're presupposing, this actually is very relevant actually to the issues of these ontologies. We're presupposing a certain state space, okay? So I'm only interested in certain color discriminations, okay? Actually, for some people, there are hundreds of shades of white that might be relevant to painting the wall white. So for them, all these different ways in which the wall can be white would be truth makers for the statement that the wall is white. Okay. But for other people, you know, that's not an issue. Okay. So for my view, the question is, how finely do you individuate the states that are the truth makers? And my own view is that this is dependent upon context. Okay. In a strange way, this is also true in the possible world semantics. Because when you talk about a possible world, you're not really talking about a possible world. You're talking about the possible that settles the questions of interest to you in the given discourse. That's what the possible world is. And similarly, when we talk about truth makers, we're talking about those that are relevant to the questions that might reasonably arise within the discourse. So there's a similar kind of context dependence here. Okay, but I get the feeling that you're after something else, which is not the job of a semantics to be doing. Of course, once you apply this, if I want to apply the semantics, I want to understand some discourse about the color of the walls or what have you, I have to make certain decisions, maybe, as to what the kind of color discriminations are called for. And it's not the job of the semanticist to say what they are. It's the job of the person who's applying the semantics to say, look, this is what's relevant. This is what's relevant here. So, sorry, I hope I'm not being too obstreperous here, but I really am trying to get at what might be a real question. Okay, why don't I go, perhaps I should go to some of these other 6 new messages. Let's look at the more recent ones.
Colorless green ideas.
I'm sorry?
Gary mentioned colorless green ideas.
Let's not go there. Yeah, actually, I really like this remark that we are never looking only at worlds as opaque points. We're always after the structure of worlds. So this is really incredibly relevant. That on the possible, if you look at the possible world semantics, they are just points. They're blobs without any internal structure. Okay. Whereas this is very different from the point of view of Truthmaker semantics. The worlds are structured. They're actually composed of states. And if we look deeper into the states, those states themselves may have a structure that's relevant to the semantics. Okay. So for us, the worlds are not just blobs. It's very important we have construction these state spaces. Yeah. Can we ask for the meaning of colorless green? I'm not going to go there. He is saying, if you describe how semantics work, how do you justify? Okay, I think okay. I mean, I guess there are 2 ways of thinking of Truthmaker semantics or any semantics. One is as the truth, and one is as a tool. Okay, and it could be a good tool without being the truth, and it could be the truth without being a good tool. And to be honest, I'm not sure. I'd like to think it's a bit of both. So I like to think even if it's not the truth, this is a useful way to think about things. And I like to think even if it's not a useful way to think about things, there's something true here. Okay. So in regard, let's still, I keep going back to Johnny. So when I give my little account of what it is for this, give a semantics for, you could, I say to Johnny, you may have ice cream or chocolate when I say that. And then I give a semantics for that statement from which, and under that semantic it follows that Johnny Johnny may have ice cream. I'm saying something genuinely illuminating about the semantics of that sentence. Insofar as you're interested in the semantics of a natural language, I'm saying something that's, I know it's true, but genuinely illuminating. It's a step in the right direction to understanding the semantics of English, or of natural language. Okay. I also think it's useful in a number of ways that often, for many purposes, we need to be able to reason deontically. So to the extent that we're interested in formalizing that reasoning, this may be a useful framework. So let's just take the issue of robots. You might want to give instructions to a robot saying what it can do. What's the best way to do this? I have not really looked into this question. My guess, for what it's worth, is the kind of formalization that I use in those papers I mentioned would be much more useful than the standard possible worlds framework. That is, if you're going to be using some formalized version of deontic logic to, let's say, program, not just, of course, robots, of course, protocols and so on involve deontic considerations as well. So this may be a much more useful framework. And again, I could explain why I think this is true, but anyway, let me just say that I think that this framework may be useful. I'm just saying these things, unless you actually get into the nitty-gritty details of how these formalizations work, these claims won't actually mean much to you. Actually, let me just make a remark here, because this I think is of incredible importance. Go back to truth functional logic. So you may be aware that there was something called the disjunctive normal form, that every formula of propositional logic, this classical logic, is equivalent to one that can be put in disjunctive normal form. It's a disjunction of state descriptions, where the state description says of each sentence letter in question is either case or not the case. Okay. When you go to, let's say, counterfactual logic, or even deontic logic and so on, we no longer have a normal form. We no longer have a normal form theorem. Okay, these things just disappear. Okay. Now, what a normal form theory tells you, when you have a normal form, it's telling you in a very perspicuous way what the sentence means. It's a very perspicuous representation. It's as close as you can get to a semantic representation in the formal language. Because I'm saying, look, either the world has to be this way, this state description being true, or that way, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if I have this complex formula with negations embedded, I have no idea what it means. Whereas if I put it in disjunctive formal form, then I know exactly what it takes. Okay. So these perspicuous representations are of great importance. What you have under Truthmaker semantics is the possibility of normal form theorems. It's the possibility of normal form theorems. Let me do a very simple illustration. Again, I'm going back to Johnny. Johnny's so helpful here. I say you're permitted to do this or that. Oh, okay, it's not such a great illustration. Let me go to get counterfactuals. Okay, I say if P or Q were the case, then R would be the case. Okay, under Truthmaker semantics, that's equivalent to if P were the case, then R would be the case. Then and if Q were the case, then R would be the case. So you can eliminate a disjunction in the antecedent. That's the important thing. You have the possibility of eliminating a disjunctive antecedent. You cannot do this within the possible world semantics. Provably cannot do this without complete collapse within the possible world semantics for counterfactuals. Okay. That kind of reduction where you eliminate a certain kind of complexity is essential for putting formulas in normal form. So what you have is the possibility. This is actually quite an extraordinary thing. You have the possibility within the Truthmaker semantics of achieving normal forms. People often think, God, you're no longer accepting these classical results, these classical equivalences. You're handicapped in not having these equivalences. Yes, you don't have these equivalences, but you have other equivalences as a result, which are far more useful to you. That's the extraordinary thing, that you can trade one kind of, I'm talking about usefulness now, you can trade one kind of equivalence for another, and an equivalence that's far more useful. So one of the extraordinary things I think about Truthmaker semantics is that it enables you to put things into normal form. So you get this perspicuous representation of what is addition. For me, this was really a revelation that Truthmaker semantics could do this. Okay.
Well, this is all really fascinating, but we've run out of time.
Okay, well, thank you for feedback. And I hope I wasn't too obstreperous in response, but anyway.
Oh, no, it's quite fascinating. Now, next week, we're going to have a synthesis session. And I expect that we will continue this discussion.
Okay.
And I hope that all of you can come next week, same time in noon Eastern time. And I'd like to thank you very much. This was a fascinating introduction to Truthmaker semantics.
Well, thank you for your feedback. I appreciate it.
And so thanks to everyone who had their questions.
Okay.
And
Thank
so
you so
we'll now
much.
adjourn and meet again next week.
Okay, very good.
Bye.
Bye.